Welcome to episode 445 of That Triathlon Show, the podcast presented by scientifictriathlon.com. I'm your host Michael, and on today's episode I'll go a bit deeper into training zones. This was originally meant to be a standard Q&A episode, and I will still read the original questions that prompted this episode, but I decided to keep it a bit more focused and not answer a bunch of different questions on multiple topics like I normally do, because I do get these kinds of questions about training zones quite a lot. So I think a lot of people have them. And by naming this episode something with training zones and having that be the focus, hopefully this helps the people that need this information find it. So that's the goal of today's episode. Before we get into the main topic though, big thanks to our sponsors, Precision Fuel and Hydration. They create carbohydrate and electrolyte products that are effective, practical, and tasty. And to me, the number one thing that any sports nutrition product needs to have is that they should not cause flavor fatigue, even in very long races, because even a relatively minor reduction in carb intake from your plan could be the difference between a PB and walking the last 10 kilometers of the run. So the product you use needs to still be appealing enough for you to keep fueling at the end of an Ironman. And this is one of the biggest advantages of Precision Fuel and Hydration's carbohydrate products. The flavor of the gels, including the big flow gel with 300 grams of carbs, makes it easy to consume as much as you want for hours on end. So you can really stick to your plan throughout the race. And don't forget, you also have drink mixes and chews as alternative energy options and electrolytes for your hydration needs. You can get a free plan for your next race with the Fuel and Hydration Planner on Precision Fuel and Hydration's website. And as a TTS listener, you can get 15% off your first order by using the code TTS24 on precisionfuelandhydration.com. And thank you to Senate. The Senate Indoor Swim Trainer is a dry land swim bench that allows you to improve technique, power, and swim training consistency. For a lot of athletes, the limitation to swim training is the time commitment, especially for those living further away from a pool. If you need a 2.5 hour time window to be able to swim for 60 minutes, then it can make it very difficult to get in more than 1 or 2 swims per week, because finding these time windows in a busy schedule is quite the challenge for most of us. And if you're in this situation where you're restricted on how much you can swim, you can use the Senate to complement your pool swimming with quick and efficient home-based workouts that challenge the swim-specific muscles, including core strength and stability, and give yourself a chance to keep improving your swimming even when you have limited time in the water. You can try the Senate risk-free for 30 days and get 20% off your first order on senatenutrition.com/TTS. Now, without any further ado, let's get into the main topic of today's episode. So we'll get into training zones here, and I'll just do it kind of like a typical Q&A and read 2 questions that I use as the basis for today's content. The first question here is from Craig, who's asking, I keep seeing information about Zone 2 training, but the rates and percentages are all over the place. I recently had a VO2 max test done, so I have some solid data, but I'm not sure what to make of all of this data. Some people are saying Zone 2 is under 80% of max heart rate, while others say it's up to 85%. Others still are saying there are 4 zones, while many others discuss 5 zones. Any guidance you can provide would be super helpful. Thanks, Craig from Hamburg. All right, thank you, Craig, for your question. So I think the first point here to discuss before even getting into the whole training zones discussion is where Craig says, I recently had a VO2 max test done, so I have some solid data, but I'm not sure what to make of all of the data. So this is a very common problem in triathlon, probably in endurance sports in general, having a lot of data, but not knowing what to do with it. An equally common problem is having the data and thinking you know what to do with it, but misunderstanding it or misinterpreting it, drawing incorrect conclusions, so the data ends up hurting rather than helping your training. And this is why, in general, I'm not a big fan of age group triathletes doing lab tests unless they have a coach who really understands the data and how to use it. Because even though labs will give you a fancy printout with training zones and sometimes even training advice, workouts based on the test that you just did, this fancy printout is actually more often than not terrible as training advice, in my opinion, from what I've seen. So the first take-home message here is, it is much better to keep things simple and effective compared to getting in over your head with details and then accidentally getting away from what is actually effective training. So that is point number 1. But that has nothing to do with training zones. But I just think with what Craig mentioned there in the question, it is always good to get a reminder of that. Simple doesn't mean bad. Simple often means good. So this question isn't really primarily about the lab test though, and we'll get to that in the next question, by the way. But the gist of the question here is about training zones. So I'll keep that the main focus for now. And then in the next question, we go a bit more into the lab testing part. The first thing to keep in mind about training zones is that while we can anchor them around physiology, around physiological markers if we want to, training zones is not a physiological concept. It's a communication tool in essence. It helps us easily convey information such as prescribing training or monitoring and analyzing training, discussing training, etc. But the caveat here is that this only works when we speak the same language, which in many cases we don't, as you very correctly have observed. Sometimes we are talking about small differences. So the examples Craig mentions about using 80% versus 85% of max heart rate as an anchor point for a zone. Other times we're talking about big differences, like using 7 different zones or 3 different zones, using power-based versus heart rate-based zones, or basing the test on some kind of physiological lab data compared to performance data from a field test or a race. So there are a whole bunch of different variables here and a whole bunch of different places where we might miscommunicate if we're not very clear. I was thinking here about whether I should, at this point, discuss how I prefer to use training zones, and by use, I mean how I determine them, what percentages of what, and so on and so forth. But actually, I think that is of very minor importance. It's of insignificance, really, since so many people are already confused with the number of different training zone systems that exist. There's not that much point in me adding to that problem, although I will do it towards the end of this episode. But I think the key thing to understand here at the top, if you take nothing else away from this episode, is that if your coach or your training plan prescribes training using training zones in any way, then you need to understand what those zones mean for that coach or for that training plan. How are they defined? And how are you supposed to execute your training accordingly? That's the only thing that matters. It's not whether they are the same or different than anybody else's, because there is no right or wrong when it comes to training zones. It is just a tool, just a communication tool. So that's the number one thing that matters here. This also relates to a piece of advice that I've mentioned before on this podcast, which is don't make your training a Frankenstein's monster by wildly mixing and matching different inputs. So for example, if person A, let's say coach A, says that they do VO2 max training at least twice per week year round, and typically they prescribe 10 times 30 seconds on, 30 seconds off. But person B says that effective VO2 max training has to be all out, at least 20 minutes total work, intervals should be at least 2 minutes long. Then either of those two different ideas on their own merit might be great and effective. But if you mix them and start doing twice weekly VO2 max sessions year round, where the sessions are 5 times 4 minutes or so, something like that, then that's a whole different thing than any one of person A or person B said originally. You're mixing and matching, you're creating a Frankenstein's monster in how you're mixing inputs. And obviously, I'm also not saying that you shouldn't take different inputs. I'm not saying that you should just copy or use one source, one holy grail of input, but there is that fine balance between how you take inputs and turn that into action, basically. So you don't want to take different inputs and get the worst of both worlds instead of the best of both worlds, and that's often what happens. So yeah, you have to be really careful with mixing and matching different inputs. So I hope that makes sense and that I wasn't rambling too much. But basically, you can't just take a small piece of advice from one source and fit it into another source of information or input without careful consideration. And this applies here to our training zones discussion. So for example, when somebody speaks to a general population audience about training, so we're not talking about experienced triathletes or even mildly experienced triathletes, we're talking about maybe the kind of person that goes to the gym twice a week and takes a walk on a Sunday. When somebody speaks to a general population audience like that, and they talk about you should be doing 80% of your training in zone 2, well, first of all, that might not be very good advice. But secondly, the implication here is typically that this audience should do most of their training way easier than they probably are doing now, which could be very reasonable advice, actually, because that's maybe what helps this type of audience get more consistent. So I actually don't disagree with that advice. And it means that training feels more daunting and maybe more fun. It gets to be that after a while. So that makes some sense. However, if you are somebody with a 380 watt FTP and now you take this advice of doing 80% of training in zone 2, and you maybe start doing all of your riding at 250 watts or above 250 watts, then this advice will cook you almost definitely. So the example here is that while zone 2 may be very easy for an untrained or recreationally trained population, it is very hard for a well-trained or professional population. So this is one of the big reasons why those lab printouts with advice are usually terrible, because, one of the reasons anyway, I think that they tend to get you to do your easy training too hard. So anyway, back to the point here. The point that I was trying to make is that if you draw small pieces of information about training zones, then you try to fit them together from multiple different sources, then that's potentially going to lead you down the path of having a completely misinterpreted system that you're using, or the application of workouts within that zone system might be super suboptimal because of the way that you have fitted pieces together that actually are not supposed to fit together. Because when we're talking training zones, you can't just take one piece from one input and another piece from another input. It doesn't really work like that. But so that's one point, number one here, not creating a Frankenstein's monster with your training zones by fitting pieces together from disparate sources. Another example here, sticking with the zone 2, is that even if we're talking about the same zone 2, you and I are both talking about, let's say, Cogn zones, 55 to 75% of FTP, then the implication of, even if we're talking about the exact same zone in this way, the implication of it can be very different based on what level of athlete we're talking about, or based on a number of other variables, but level of athlete is a super important one. So for an athlete with a 380 watt FTP, zone 2 is very, very broad, from 209 to 285 watts. So while it may be a good training prescription from a coach to an athlete to say, just go and ride in zone 2, the athlete then gets the autonomy to self-regulate within a wide zone. It can also be terrible if the athlete tends to just always automatically go to the top of a given zone, and that zone is extremely wide and it gives an extremely high top end of the zone. It can also be pretty terrible in terms of communication information, for example, on a podcast, or at least in terms of listening to podcasts and not understanding that sitting at the low end of the zone might be just as good as sitting on the high end of the zone, because riding at 209 watts versus 285 watts is, of course, extremely different, even if you have an FTP of 380 watts. In contrast, for an athlete with an FTP of 180 watts, zone 2 would be between 99 to 135 watts. So in this case, it's starting to get narrow enough that it kind of works to just say zone 2, and you're not really losing that much context because it's a narrow enough range of power. But we have to really understand that context and the implications based on different variables, such as athlete level, even when we're talking about zones using the same definitions and the same language, so to say. But let me talk about how I use training zones and what I think they're good for. And I'm not quite ready to get into the actual definition and anchor points about the zones, but actually more at a philosophical level, how I use them. So the number one case, or not the number one in terms of the most important, but the first case that I mention is that in certain cases I might use them for training prescription, but it's not, to be honest, something that I do very commonly. I rarely, if ever, prescribe a swim, bike, or run to be done in a certain zone completely. So I rarely say do a zone 2 bike or a zone 1 run or whatever. Sometimes I use zones in addition to other verbal cues to clarify the prescription. For example, I might say in citation marks, easy run, RPE 2 to 3, in parentheses, zone 1, end citation mark. Or somebody might have a swim with a bunch of intervals in the main set, and then after that main set of intervals, I might prescribe, quote, 600 at zone 2 feeling, end quote. And this is kind of the same as me saying 600 steady endurance, RPE 45. So this is in my coaching vernacular, and the point isn't whether that's better or worse than other systems. And it's perfect if my athletes understand me perfectly, and if they don't, then it's not so good. But that's the only thing that matters, that my athletes understand me. But in summary, I actually use zones pretty rarely in training prescription, because even those examples, it's not that often that I use them. I would tend to stick to those terms like steady endurance or RPE 45, for example. Or of course, when we talk about higher intensities, which I'll get to, I tend to give more specific power and pace and heart rate guidelines in combination with verbal cues. But point number 2, where I use zones, and this is much more important and much more useful, I think, is analysis. And yeah, I think this is where zones are the most useful, probably. Largely, analysis when it comes to zones is about time in zone, but there are many different layers to this. Firstly, you can look at this from pace or power or a heart rate perspective, or all of them. They are all useful. Secondly, you can do this at the level of an individual workout or race. So for example, looking at a race, how much time did you spend in zone 3, zone 4, zone 5, etc. But you can also do this over a period of time. For example, your last 6 weeks leading into your key race. And if somebody has a bad run in a key race, then I might compare the time in zone in the 6 weeks leading up to that race compared to the race before, where they had a great run, and see if I can immediately spot some differences and then dig deeper into that. Or at a racing level, I can look at the time in zone of the bike leg in this race and the previous one, and perhaps I find that they spent a lot more time in zone 5 in this race where they didn't run well, and that compared to the previous race where they did run well. So perhaps that is the difference we need to focus in on. But just like before, this only works, this is only meaningful when you know how the zones are defined and what that means in different contexts. So athlete level will have a huge impact here on the implications of the analysis for the reasons we discussed already, but there are also other factors to consider. But yeah, I think that wraps up analysis, or it's a lot about time in zone, but at both a workout level, at a more longer time period level, and also in terms of different variables such as heart rate, power, pace. And number 3, in terms of the things that I use training zones for, is high level description. So while there is a discrepancy among how people use training zones, as we already discussed, I do feel there is still some general consensus, at least if you look at the triathlon space, so within this sport, about what the most common used zone systems are. So if you ask me, I think most people tend to go with something like a 5-zone system, where zone 1 is easy, zone 2 is steady, let's call it Ironman effort, zone 3 is tempo or zone 1-3 effort, zone 4 is threshold, Olympic to sprint distance effort, and zone 5 is VO2 max. And maybe you have really fast speeds and high powers, you might have a zone 6 or even a zone 7 on top of that, but those are not really that relevant. And while people may disagree on where one zone ends and the next one begins, is it 80%, is it 85%, is it 75%? I would say that in terms of the midpoints or mid-ranges of the zones, there probably is decent consensus on that, at least in terms of power and speed. Heart rate, admittedly, is a bit more all over the place. I do agree, it shouldn't be. And maybe we can have a discussion why that is another time. Maybe it is because heart rate is quite a bit more individual, and I don't actually know. But anyway, basically, if you and I have a coffee before our next race and discuss our training in the lead up, I think it's quite practical to use zones as a communication tool to give a high level description of your training, such as, I don't know, a fair bit of zone 4 work leading into this race to explain my training, instead of saying what powers or paces I've been training at and how that relates to my race powers and race paces, or maximum like time trial powers and paces, because that gets much more complex and convoluted. So at a high level description, using zones when there is some level of consensus works reasonably well. But as already mentioned, there are downsides to this. For example, when we talk about things like a very wide zone 2, or for that matter, the potential for misinterpretation if somebody is using a different zone system. So it definitely doesn't allow you to to a level of detail describe what you're doing or ask about somebody's training, but it allows you perhaps to give a broad overview of it that is relatively easily understandable to a reasonably accurate degree. So those are basically, to summarize that, the three things that I use zones for is: one, prescription, but not super rarely, but in a very limited capacity. I use it for prescription. Number two, this is where I use it the most, is for analysis. And number three, high level description, which actually is quite well for example, on this podcast, talk about zone 4 and not really needing to discuss whether that is 90% or 95% of FTP or 100%. But now the next thing I want to talk about, which is perhaps one of the last things before we get into question number 2, is some common mistakes to avoid when it comes to training zones. And some of them I've already discussed here, so I'll just briefly rush through them. And number 1 is to assume that everybody's talking about the same thing when they talk about a particular zone whatever, because that's not necessarily the case. Number 2 is to think that zones are based on physiology. Some zones might be anchored around physiological markers, but it doesn't mean that there is a physiological difference between zone X and zone Y. And this also can differ between different zone systems. What I mean there is that some zone systems are anchored perhaps around physiological markers, but others are not. The key thing is to remember is that changes in intensity leads to changes in physiology along a continuum, not in discrete points. So the difference between the top end of zone 3 and the bottom end of zone 4 is nothing. So we shouldn't consider them as like that distinct, really. It is a spectrum, a continuum. Mistake number 3 is to assume that zone X does the same and has the same benefits and drawbacks for athlete A and athlete B. We discussed this. The implications of one zone for different athletes can be quite different. Even if we're both talking about the same zones, we understand and have the same definitions. Zone X might be quite different for athlete A and athlete B based on, for example, the level of each of these athletes. Mistake number 4 is using zones for prescription. It's not a deadly sin. It's not the worst thing in the world, but I don't think it's ideal. For easier workouts, it can be just fine. For example, especially for zone 1, I think it's totally fine. 1 hour run in heart rate zone 1, 2 hour bike in power zone 1. Those are totally fine, even if it's not the way that I prefer to prescribe a workout. When we get to zone 2 and above, I think just using a zone as a prescription leaves a lot for interpretation. And I would prefer, depending on the workout, to prescribe a pace, power, or heart rate range to target, or several of those, of course, and along with some verbal cues for effort level or RPE rating that it should roughly feel like. And I'll give you some examples here. So I was looking through some of the workouts that my coach athletes have been doing this week, and I'll read some prescriptions for you here to see. This is just to give you an example of how I prescribe different kinds of workouts. Again, not saying that it's better or worse than anything else, but the main thing here is that the athlete understands and that they execute. If I get a lot of athletes that don't execute the way that I meant for them to, then I have a problem. But if they execute the way that I intended, then the way that I prescribe works well. So you can also see here in this different list of workouts or these different examples how I like to prescribe similar kinds of workouts, but vary the prescription. The prescription is slightly different based on the different type of athlete and things like terrain and equipment and so on. So it'll just give you some inspiration. So here is workout number 1, which is a bike. Description: mostly an easy endurance ride, RPE 3 to 4, but include the following sprint set after a good warm-up of at least 20 minutes. 10 times 10-second all-out sprint, 4 minutes 50 seconds easy, RPE 1 to 3. Odd sets, seated sprints, even sets, standing sprints. That's the description. Workout number 2 here is a swim. Main set, I won't prescribe or read out the warm-up. Main set, 3 rounds of 3 times 100, 45-second rest interval, 200s easy with choice toys, 60-second rest interval. Repeat 3 rounds. Pacing for the 100s should be as follows. Best average for the session. You might need to hold back 1 to 2 seconds for the first couple of rounds to be able to maintain that same pace and achieve your best average in the final round. And workout number 4 here is a run. Warm up 3 kilometers or more easy with some building efforts. Main set 6 times 1 kilometers at target half marathon pace or slightly slower, up to 10 seconds per kilometer slower than goal pace is fine. 400 meter easy jog between intervals. Easy warm down to prescribed distance. And session number 4, example number 4 is a bike. Main set 7 times 6 minutes at 340 to 360 watts with 3-minute easy spin recoveries. Then about 10 minutes easy, then 20 minutes at, quote, tempo effort, end quote. Warm up and warm down to suit. And the last one is a run. Warm up 4 kilometers easy. Main set 3 times 3 rounds of 4 kilometers as 500 meters at 340 per kilometer pace. 500 meters at 310 per kilometer pace. 1 kilometer at 4:30 to 4-minute kilometer pace. And 3 rounds of that 4 kilometer plus 1 kilometer. And 4 kilometer easy warm down. So I'm not going through these workouts because they are amazing workouts that you should copy. Any workout can be terrible or they can be great depending on the program it is in and the athlete that actually does the workout and does the program. So I'm doing it to give you an idea of a few concepts that I think are valuable to consider for your own training prescription, especially if you're self-coached. So number 1 is using ranges rather than exact targets. So actually in the last session that I read, when I talk about 500 meters at 340 kilometer pace, 500 meters at 310, I used the squiggly line, the tilde, to indicate roughly 340, so 340 plus minus, and roughly 310 plus minus. So even though I didn't give an exact range, the squiggly line there indicates that we're talking about not an exact target necessarily. So point number 1 here is using ranges rather than exact targets and anchoring to, in some cases, best efforts. So we had that bike sprint session. What was the prescription there? All out sprint. And we had the swim with the 100s, which were best average for the session. The third point that you can use is anchoring to race efforts. So we had some explicit and some implicit. For example, that last run with 340 and 310, there's some implicit race effort anchoring there based on the race that is being trained for. But we also had the target half marathon pace run session. And yeah, that's about it. So, and then the final one is using verbal cues for input. And using RPE and let the body sort out the rest. So we have things like, especially in the warm-ups, it's not a pace, it's not a power, it's easy, it's building efforts. And then we even had in the main sets, we had things like tempo effort without any specific power target or heart rate target after that set of intervals. So using verbal cues, using RPE and seeing what comes out on the day. These are some tips for prescription that I think are much more effective than using zones for prescription. So yeah, I think that's about it. To finish up on this question, and I will discuss the actual, like an example of how you can set your zones actually without lab testing in the next question, even though the question is about lab testing. But to finish up on this question here is that unfortunately it is confusing today because there are so many different systems out there. And everybody is talking about things a bit differently without necessarily defining their zones. And I know that I'm also guilty of that. But it essentially boils down to the fact that training zones is mainly a communication tool and different people communicate differently. So I hope that this has helped make things a bit clearer and especially that it will help you avoid some potential pitfalls that are easy to fall into when it comes to training zones. And I think the main thing to remember, to go back to the very beginning of my answer, is you just need to know what your coach is communicating to you or what your training plan is communicating to you. And then other than that, it doesn't really matter. It's about the training, not about the arbitrary zone that we're talking about. Yeah, that's it. Thank you for your question, Craig. Now let's go into question number 2, which is from Jaume, who writes, you may have discussed this in older episodes, but what's the main difference between LT2 and VT2? Which protocol do you recommend to use to determine your training zones? My approach here is that lactate testing is better since 2 athletes with the same VO2 max may be able to sustain that effort for different amounts of time, depending on the lactate that their bodies are generating at the effort. But I would like to know your thoughts on this. So again, thank you, Jean, for your question. It's a really good one. I will say before going any further that there might be a few minutes here where things get a bit technical. Feel free to tune out. The technical bits are not important at all, to be honest, but don't turn off the episode because we will get to some very practical applications more towards the end of the answer, and some field-based estimates for the first and second thresholds as well that you can use that are simple to determine. And now onto the rest of the answer. So LT1 and LT2 are lactate threshold 1 and 2, the first and second lactate threshold. VT1 and VT2 correspondingly are ventilatory thresholds 1 and 2, or the first and second ventilatory thresholds. The main difference between these is that they are determined using different testing equipment and methodologies. So for both of them, you will be doing a step test where you gradually increase intensity. For example, on the bike, it might be an increase of intensity by 25 watts every 3 minutes. It could be longer. That would be my preference, which I'll get to in a bit. Or if you're running, you might increase your speed by 1 kilometers an hour every minute. Every 3 minutes, or every 4 minutes, or every 5 minutes. In a lactate test, you would draw blood and measure the blood lactate concentration at the end of each step, whereas in a gas exchange test, which is the test where you're using a mask and a metabolic cart to measure the oxygen uptake and the CO2 production in the body through that mask, then the metabolic cart, the associated software, etc., they continuously, during the entire test, they measure many variables, but, well, not many, but several. Some very important ones that we'll talk about here are oxygen uptake, carbon dioxide production, CO2 production, and minute ventilation, which is the amount of air you inhale and exhale per minute in liters. In the lactate test, famously, there are lots of definitions for the first and second lactate threshold, so it's definitely not clear-cut. I can only speak from my preferences, but I prefer to simply look at the first and second inflection points of a lactate curve, which is very easy in theory, but then depending on what the curve looks like in practice, it's not always that easy. The first one especially can sometimes be a bit harder to see. So another thing that I might use as a guideline is an increase in blood lactate concentration by 0.5 millimoles per liter or more from baseline if there isn't a super clear-cut first inflection point visible. So that's, that would be the first. And then you would have a second, after that first inflection point, basically you would have maybe a straight line, ideally, and then you would have a linear increase from the first threshold to the second threshold, and then you would have a steeper increase in lactate after a second threshold. I'll try to put some figures in the show notes so you can have a look at that, at an idealized lactate curve and where the thresholds would fall. In a gas exchange test, the first ventilatory threshold, and this is where things get technical, by the way, for a few minutes. The first ventilatory threshold, VT1, is determined by an increase in the ventilatory equivalent of oxygen, which is, it's VE, the ratio of minute ventilation to oxygen uptake. So VE divided by VO2 is how it's denoted. So basically it means how much air is being ventilated per liter of oxygen consumed. So it's kind of a measure of the efficiency of your breathing relative to oxygen uptake. Now, why does this indicate the first ventilatory threshold? This is because until this first threshold, carbon dioxide production and removal can be quite stable. Above this threshold, there is an increase in carbon dioxide production because it is a consequence of the increased concentration of hydrogen ions that accompanies an increase in lactate. So the hydrogen ions are acidic and cause muscle acidosis unless they are buffered. And the result of this buffering process in the body is an increase in carbon dioxide production. The body does not like to have carbon dioxide floating around and tries to expel it through ventilation. So what happens is, at this first threshold, when we start to have an increase in carbon dioxide production, the body increases ventilation in order to expel carbon dioxide. And this means that the ratio of ventilation to oxygen uptake increases because you get a bigger increase in ventilation than you get in oxygen uptake. Because until the first threshold, an increase in ventilation had an equivalent increase in oxygen uptake. The ratio was pretty much a constant. But so here you can see that this is related to LT1, but a step behind in a way, because that increase in lactate and hydrogen ions is what leads to the increased carbon dioxide production. and therefore an increase in the ventilatory equivalent for oxygen. So it's a consequence of the increase in lactate concentration that happens at LT1 that results in VT1, basically. This is why, normally, if you measure a group of athletes with both lactate and gas exchange tests, the ventilatory thresholds will generally be a bit higher than the lactate thresholds. So, yeah, again, I know this is a bit complicated, especially without figures to illustrate, but I will try to put something in the show notes here. The good thing is there's no real benefit in knowing the definition of VT1 and how it's measured, as long as you know that it's basically the same as LT1, but measured in a different way, and it often ends up being a bit higher. So the power is a bit higher, or the pace is a bit higher in terms of better, faster. But bear with me, and I'll just quickly explain how VT2 is determined for those curious, and then we'll get away from the technical stuff. So VT1 was an increase in the ventilatory equivalent for oxygen, so the ratio of ventilation to oxygen uptake. VT2, on the other hand, is where we see an increase in the ventilatory equivalent for carbon dioxide, so the ratio of minute ventilation to carbon dioxide production. And this is a measure that indicates how efficiently the respiratory system is expelling carbon dioxide relative to how much is being produced. Below VT2, this measure is relatively stable because ventilation increases proportionally to carbon dioxide production to maintain the balance of carbon dioxide production and removal. But as you get to this second threshold, above which, looking at the lactate threshold side of things, above which lactate production exceeds clearance and lactate starts to accumulate rapidly, and therefore also hydrogen ions start to accumulate rapidly, you have this sharp increase in hydrogen ions, and the body attempts to buffer the acidosis, which results in a corresponding increase in carbon dioxide production. And as we have seen, the body wants to get rid of the excess carbon dioxide, so it increases ventilation. But here, the minute ventilation increases disproportionately to carbon dioxide production, which is an effect that is called ventilatory compensation for acidosis. So it means that the ratio of ventilation to carbon dioxide production increases, and this increase in the ratio in the ventilatory equivalent of carbon dioxide is what indicates VT2, the second ventilatory threshold, which is also called the respiratory compensation point, which, as you can imagine, is because of the ventilatory compensation for acidosis effect. Again, VT2 moves in lockstep with LT2, but with LT2 typically being a bit lower than VT2, just as we saw with the first thresholds. So now we're done with the technical part. Sorry about that. Again, not at all important. But is one system better than the other? Is lactate testing better, or is ventilator testing better? In my opinion, not really. The crucial thing is that the equipment, whether it's a metabolic cart or a lactate meter, is accurate and well calibrated, and the person handling it knows what they're doing. If the raw data collected in the tests is reliable and accurate, then either type of test is very good. The advantage of a gas exchange test is that it measures continuously throughout the test, so you can have a bit more certainty or at least more knowledge of the measurement error than with a lactate test, and maybe more easily also identify if a test is suspicious and maybe not reliable. The disadvantage is that it's generally much more expensive, or at least somewhat more expensive. One very important factor, though, is the step length in the protocol. So if you offer me a 3-minute step length gas exchange test or a 5-minute step length lactate test, I'll take the lactate test any day of the week, and vice versa. I think labs often offer 3-minute steps with their gas exchange tests and also with lactate tests. And sometimes the physiology hasn't stabilized sufficiently, so the data you get is not really reflective of a stable, steady-state physiology, which is what you want with these kinds of tests until you get to the second threshold, which of course, above which you don't have a steady-state physiology. But in a gas exchange test, you can visually inspect it and see if this is the case, if there is a steady state reached or not. But in a lactate test, you can't, which is why step length would be even more important to consider for a lactate test. That said, 3 minutes I would say is almost always too short. I would go for a minimum of 4 minutes, but ideally 5 or even 6 to make sure you get really reliable data, no matter what the testing protocol and testing equipment is. So that's the answer to one of Jean's main question, which was which one is better. In my opinion, one is not better than the other, but there are definitely considerations with the protocol, especially in terms of step length, but also in terms of the ability to make sure that the equipment and personnel doing the test does a really good job with that and make sure that you get reliable data. The final point in the question was, Shom wrote, my approach here is that lactate testing is better since two athletes with the same VO2 max may be able to sustain that effort for different amounts of time, depending on the lactate that their bodies are generating at these efforts. This, I would say, is a misconception of what the ventilatory thresholds are, because as we saw when I described the tests, the ventilatory thresholds are very strongly correlated to the lactate thresholds, and how they are determined has nothing to do with VO2 max. You can do a test to find your ventilatory thresholds without going to maximum, without actually testing your VO2 max, even though typically you would combine both to also get your VO2 max information and your thresholds from the same test. So maybe once you have seen that you have reached above VT2 with those, let's say, 4-minute steps, then you might go to increase pace, increase power every 30 seconds until failure and see what VO2 max you get. Or you might even have a 10-minute rest and then do a separate incremental test where you ramp up intensity every 30 seconds and until failure to get VO2 max. So yeah, I think I already answered this part of the question basically by saying that none of them is better than the other, but you can definitely screw up your training real good if you do these tests with bad equipment or not using it, not having the correct protocols or not analyzing the data correctly. So it comes down to that more so than which particular method that you're using in terms of ventilatory and lactate thresholds. Both are really good when done correctly. I do think that there are definitely cases where it's warranted to do either one of these tests in a lab, for example, to get a deeper physiological understanding of an athlete. Definitely more so at an elite end of the spectrum, where it gets harder and harder to find improvements and you need to start looking for more marginal gains. For me, I would say that 80% of the athletes that I work with, I don't see the need to use any kind of lab test like this necessarily. I have quite a simple method to estimate the first and second thresholds, which is if we start on the heart rate side of things, I estimate the first threshold to be 70 to 80% of the maximum heart rate in the particular sport. So it's the maximum heart rate for the bike or the maximum heart rate for the run. And 70% would be at a low fitness level and 80% the high fitness level. And then you might have somewhere in between for something in between. And similarly for the second threshold, it would be between 80 to 90% of the maximum sport-specific heart rate, again, depending on fitness level. Moving on to pace-wise, setting the first and second thresholds in terms of paces for running. The first threshold I would set to somewhere between half marathon pace to 90% of marathon pace. Half marathon pace being for the less fit individual, and 90% of marathon pace for the very fit individual, running close to 2 hours, or like at least, let's say, 2 hours 20 for the marathon. And otherwise, it might be something like marathon pace for somebody in between. And yeah, there are obviously different points on the spectrum there, but that's something that I identify based on the athlete fitness level. So I'm just giving you the ranges here and I showing that it basically depends quite a bit on the fitness level of the athlete. The second threshold I would set as the athlete's 10K pace to half marathon pace. 10K pace for the less fit individual and half marathon pace for the more fit individual. And it might be something in between there for somebody who's in between. And again, when I say more fit individual, I'm talking the half marathon pace would be at the very elite and somebody running the half marathon at an hour or so, close to an hour. And power-wise, the first threshold I would set to 70.3 bike power to Ironman bike power, depending on fitness level. And the second threshold I would set to critical power, because I think critical power testing is very easy to do. It is quite illustrative, and so that's basically something I do with almost all of my athletes, and so that one we get as critical power. If an athlete hasn't done something like a 10K road race, then that's something that I also encourage to do at least once per year. But other than that, using historical race data, have you done a half marathon, a marathon? What Ironman powers, half Ironman powers, Olympic distance powers are you usually riding at? And so on and so forth. Using historical race data, also training data, especially for things like maximum heart rate, which maybe you don't get in a longer race, but in a shorter race or in certain training sessions. all of that data can get me very close to where the actual tested values would be. But in terms of training effectiveness, it really doesn't matter if I'm not super close, if I'm 10 to 20 watts off or 5 to 10 beats per minute off, because if you just iterate in training based on how the training progresses. So while the physiological markers or estimated physiological markers can give a good starting point for training prescription, they are not determinants for training prescription. What you did last week in training, that is an important determinant for training prescription for what you will do this week and next week. And what you do this week and next week is a big and important determinant for what you will do the week after. So basically, if it sounds like these ranges that were giving were extremely broad and vague and unscientific, I guess, then perhaps, but it really works. It's really effective and it's reliable. I think it's very reliable. So it's simple, and it saves money, saves time, and saves effort. So you can focus more on training. So I think that it's a pretty good system, but that's not to say that it's not a good thing to do a lab test. It can definitely add something for some athletes, but most athletes probably don't need it. It can be an interesting thing to see, perhaps get some additional data that is useful, but I think you can get really, really far with the field and race-based data, and you can also estimate your physiological markers, physiological anchor points pretty well based on those, and then set your training zones as well around those anchor points. So I think that is it. I'll wrap it up there. I hope that you enjoyed this episode, and I hope that I didn't ramble too much. It's always really difficult to do these solo episodes where I just talk nonstop for 45, 50 minutes, an hour. But hopefully the message gets through and you find it helpful. As always, you can find the show notes on scientifictriathlon.com. And I will try to find some good charts to put in the show notes explaining things like the identification of the first and second lactate and ventilatory thresholds to make that part a bit more visual for those interested. And then just a bit of promotion here before we finish off. If you want to discuss your training questions directly and in detail with follow-up questions, practical tips and takeaways, and the full context of your individual situation, there are several things that we offer that allows you to do that. So first, of course, we have our individual coaching services. Coaching is not a training plan. The coaching that we do does not have any limits on the communication that you have with your coach. And the goal is not just to help you get fitter, achieve your goals, and become a better athlete, but also that you can learn about training. So if you one day stop working with us, you'll be much better off, much better at coaching yourself than you were before. The second option that we have for chatting about training, asking questions like this, is consultations. So we offer one-off consultations or perhaps semi-regular, frequent consultations, whatever you prefer, where we can discuss any questions you may have. And this might be a good idea for somebody who's not ready to commit to full ongoing coaching, but might want to have a chat every once in a while to see if they're on the right track, or just have some questions about getting some advice on how to set up your training, or whatever it might be that you might need some help with. And finally, we have our training camps. Next year, we have 2 of them, in Mallorca in early April and in the Algarve in Portugal in late April to early May. So in addition to a great week of training to boost your fitness, these camps offer great opportunities to chat with me and the other scientific triathlon coaches on long rides or at the breakfast and dinner table. So you can go home not just with a lot of fitness in the bank, but also lots of learnings and ideas. And you can find out more about all of these options, how we can help you on scientifictriathlon.com. And you can email me directly if you have any further questions about any of these services. The season is nearly over. Maybe it's already over for you. So if you have goals for 2025, it is a great time right now to be thinking about how you can achieve them and become the best athlete you can be. And we would certainly be thrilled to help you on that journey. Now, finally, big thanks to our sponsors, Precision Fuel Hydration, that you can find on precisionfuelhydration.com. If you're looking for high quality, practical, and tasty fueling and hydration products, make sure to try Precision Fuel Hydration. There are a range of options from drink mix to gels to choose, so you can easily find your personal favorite. Don't forget to take 15% off your first order with the code TTS24. And thank you to Zen8. The Zen8 swim trainer is a great tool to have in your toolbox to improve your technique and power, to target specific aspects of your stroke, and to maintain consistency when you don't have time to get to the pool. You can try the Zen8 risk-free for up to 30 days and get 20% off your first order on zen8swimtrainer.com/TTS. Thank you, as always, for listening. Keep training smart and keep loving triathlon.